I mentioned earlier in the lectures this week about the rise of the producer, and I'd like to take a little bit more time to focus on that and the way that developed during this period here in rock and roll between 1960 and 63. In previous times, before this started to happen around 1960, the producer at a session was basically what's called an A&R man, artists in repertoire. An A&R man at a session was basically the guy who was trying to make sure that everything was organized so that, you got to pay for studio time. So if you've got a 2-hour session or a 3-hour session, you got to make sure everything gets done. So the record company would send somebody down there to be sure everything was getting done. But usually that person was not in charge of the musical matters there, but more just making sure that things happen in a timely fashion, that the musicians and the other people there didn't fritter away the record company's money, not moving the session along in an efficient way. But what started to happen under the influence of Leiber and Stoler is that there was somebody at the session whose job it was to sort of help shape the way the record would sound. They might have been the songwriter, but sometimes they might not have been the songwriter. They might be producing somebody else's song. And so you start to think about these records as not just being snapshot performances of what might otherwise be just a live performance. I mean, think about it. If you take a snapshot recording of a performance, you imagine you don't need a producer at all. The performer just performs the piece, and so long as you've got your levels right and your microphones placed properly, that's all it takes. But what's starting to happen now is people are beginning to realize that there are ways of getting things to sound better in a recording studio, maybe even better or differently or more interestingly than they can actually sound acoustically in the real world. As you begin to place mics in different kinds of places and mix them together, you can get sounds that you couldn't get in a live situation, and people start to become experts at this kind of thing, not just recording engineers, but people who have an idea how they want the record to sound, or different styles they want it to touch on, various kinds of ways in which they want to project the song. So you're starting to move toward this idea that actually moves away from the old Tin Pan Alley idea of a song as being something that is basically can be reproduced in various versions. You're starting to move toward an idea here already that it's a particular version that sounds a particular way that you might want to have. We're starting to move toward the kinds of things we'll see Brian Wilson doing in Pet Sounds or the Beach Boys doing in Sgt. Pepper. But it's very early days now. Leiber and Stoler, as I say, importantly, working with the Coasters. We've talked about all that already, and talked about them, mentioned that they were not so much writing songs anymore, but writing records. Of course, having worked with Elvis and written songs for Elvis and worked with him on the movie Jailhouse Rock, they had a certain amount of ability to demand certain kinds of things because they were the top songwriters in the business. Starting from working on producing singles for the Robins, Smokey Joe's Cafe, 1955. As I was talking before, they work with the Coasters. Some of those playlets that we talked about before, Down in Mexico from 1956, and Yakety Yak from 1958, Charlie Brown from 1959. Those are interesting records for the Coasters and for Leiber and Stoler because they really do what Chuck Berry was doing. That is, Yakety Yak talks about a kid that if he doesn't do his chores, he won't get his weekly allowance. And Charlie Brown is about a kid that's always getting picked on in high school. Song approaches that really sort of go right at teenage life. But we're talking about 58, 59, so that was pretty current for that time. The record that really kind of breaks the whole production thing open for Leiber and Stoler as a record for the Drifters called There Goes My Baby from 1959. But we'll talk more about that in the next video when we talk about the development of Sweet Soul. After Leiber and Stoler started to show that you could sort of craft these records, you get things like we mentioned before, the Shirelles doing Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, a Goff and King song that was a big hit in 1960. But that was a song where Carole King had such a specific idea about how she wanted some of the parts played, for example, the timpani part, that she couldn't just stay in the booth and issue instructions. She actually went into the studio studio and demonstrated and played it for the person exactly how she wanted it done, because she had a specific idea. You could see that Carole King, Jerry Goffin, working under Leiber and Stoler almost as apprentices, were beginning to sort of see that they could begin to shape these sounds in the studio in this kind of way. But when we talk about the record producer in the early 60s, at least in this country, maybe if we were talking about the UK, we'd be talking about somebody like Joe Meek, who's recently come much more to everybody's attention. But in this country, record producer, early 1960s, we're talking about Phil Spector. And if we're talking about Phil Spector, we're talking about the wall of sound. Now, Phil Spector goes back in the popular music business at least to 1958 as a member of a group called the Teddy Bears, who had a hit called "To Know Him Is to Love Him." Interestingly, it seems, Phil Spector, who wrote that song, got the title of the song from an inscription on his father's tombstone, which basically sort of gave the name and the dates and said, "To know him was to love him." And so he thought, now there's a song title, the mark of a songwriter probably, who can take inspiration from such things. And so that was basically a kind of a doo-wop tune, "To Know Him Is to Love Him." But he started to get under the sort of apprenticeship with Leiber and Stoler. He started to get into the studio and developed his own approach to record production. Here's the best way to understand, I think, Phil Spector's approach. Phil's records were done entirely in mono, which back in those days and still today means all the sound is coming through a single speaker. Now, most people are used to listening to music in stereo. So if you're sitting in a good room, you're equally placed between two speakers. You're going to hear sound coming out, not only from those two speakers, but the illusion will be created that there is sound all in front of you, so that the snare drum can seem to be coming from the center of the mix, even though there's not actually a speaker there. A voice can seem to be coming from over here, even when there's not a speaker there, because that's the way our ears work. You get this thing in stereo. As you start to get into the 70s, groups like Steely Dan, other groups like that, sort of specialize in creating this really rich soundscape where things are spread out in front of you in stereo. Phil Spector, exactly the opposite of that. It's all in mono. So what he wants to do is in mono, he wants to create the biggest sounding record he can. So he gets tons and tons of instruments into a recording studio. Everybody gets a microphone, but the sound of this guy's instrument is going into that guy's microphone, and it's all mixing together like a kind of soup, creating what he called the wall of sound. And for its day, that particular production technique of taking a lot of instruments in an enclosed space, miking everything up, and then putting it all through the mixing board and let it all sort of resolve together like a kind of, like a kind of soup or something like that, where there are all kinds of different ingredients, but you can't exactly pick out exactly what the different ingredients are. Maybe you can taste a little bit of this, maybe a little bit of that, but it all kind of blends together into a particular kind of distinctive taste. This blends together into a distinctive kind of sound. It's called the wall of sound, and it's entirely associated with Phil Spector. Back in those days, most people felt like Phil Spector records sounded, on a little kind of car speaker that people would hear these things on, sounded bigger than anybody else's records in the business. So if you want to hear some good examples of Phil Spector and the Wall of Sound, check out the Crystals' "Da Doo Ron Ron" from 1963, a song he wrote together with Jeff Berry and Ellie Greenwich, which features Darlene Love on lead vocals. Check out the Crystals' "Da Doo Ron Ron," or the Ronettes' "Be My Baby" from 1963. That one's got Ronnie Bennett, later to become his wife, Ronnie Spector, on lead vocals. Those two, "Da Doo Ron Ron" and "Be My Baby," really give you a sense of what Phil Spector and the Wall of Sound were all about. A lot of people think Phil Spector was kind of off the charts once the Beatles came in 1964, but his version, his production of the Righteous Brothers, "You've Got That Love and Feeling," was a big hit for him in 1964. He was actually quite friendly with the Beatles, was sitting next to Paul McCartney on the plane when it arrived in JFK when the Beatles came here for the first time, gave him a lot of career advice, also gave the Rolling Stones a lot of advice, came back at the end of the Beatles' career in '69 to produce that Let It Be album, produced the first couple solo albums by John Lennon and George Harrison. So Phil Spector, a very important figure in the history of rock, but in our story right now, we're really thinking about Phil Spector, this new role of the producer, and his invention of the idea of the wall of sound. We now turn to thinking about the invention of sweet soul during this period.